Sup guys, I'm going to be going over the new ships for the 8th Japanese Anniversary event, starring Hakuho and I-404. Everything should already be up on all the wikis by now, so there's no need to use the data mine at this point. Her kit is quite straightforward, and her strengths and weaknesses are quite surface level. First, she has a flex spot in her first slot, but it's purely for a cosmetic purpose. Due to her third skill giving her first slot a 50% efficiency bonus when using torpedo bombers, but just 15% anti-air stat otherwise, which is probably the most useless stat for carriers, as it only reduces their damage taken from opposing aircraft. In practice, you'll either want to use a torpedo bomber in her first slot, and if that's not good enough, then that is a sign that you should be using another ship instead. Because of this completely lopsided power balance between the two modes, you should just look at her first slot as a torpedo bomber slot with 160% efficiency and 2 planes. Her total loadout is therefore 2 torpedo bombers at 160% efficiency, 5 more at 155% efficiency, and then 3 dive bombers at 115% efficiency. Her dive bomber slot is not super strong, but this does mean that you can use a faster plane in her dive bomber slot for timing purposes without sacrificing as much damage. From the loadout alone, we can already tell what kind of environment she's going to excel in, but it's further solidified by her first skill buff, which gives her 14% extra damage only when against heavy armor enemies, and damage reduction otherwise, which as a main fleet ship is very low priority. The skill also gives her some stat buffs and damage reduction for the Vanguard of course, which is useful, but those don't really skew her identity in one way or another. The final nail in the coffin is her skill 2 Barrage, which deals almost 4 times as much damage against heavy than light armor due to its unique armor modifiers. It's decent against medium armor as well, but she's not going to be competitive with the LA9 spammers against medium armor anyway. The only complexity in her kit is in her skill 2, which cycles through 3 different effects whenever an IJN main fleet ship attacks. As the lone IJN ship in your fleet, you only get her insanely powerful Barrage 1 in 3 airstrikes, so you'll have to divide the Barrage damage by 3 to get its average damage, but in reality it could be anywhere from half her Barrages to only a quarter of her Barrages in actual battles, because you could do a fight where she gets 2 airstrikes off, in which case she procs the Barrage in half the airstrikes, or the fight could last 4 airstrikes, in which case only 1 out of 4 airstrikes activates the Barrage. In comparison to the Barrage, which fires 16 aimed torpedoes at the target, totaling to 6k base damage against heavy, the other 2 effects are quite tame. If you use her with just one other IJN main fleet ship, for example either Shinano or Amagi, her output is significantly increased, proccing her Barrage on 2/3 of her airstrikes. In a fight where she launches 4 times, which is quite common in meta or arbiter fights, with one other IJN ally, she'll activate the Barrage 3 times, so it ends up being very close to her full potential. Comparing her damage potential to Amagi, who had the highest damage output against heavy armor out of the carriers before Hakuho, you'll see that, even without calculations, everything is higher across the board, whether it be her aviation, loadout, self-buffs, or Barrage damage, assuming she's sortied with at least one other IJN main fleet ship. Amagi, however, does have the 15% torpedo damage for all IJN ships in the fleet, and its value will vary based on the type of vanguards you're going to be using. Okay, in practice, here's how I think it'll go down. As a solo carrier, I don't think she'll be worth considering at all with her inability to cycle through her skill 2 effects efficiently, outputting about equivalent or less damage than Amagi by herself, while not providing any of the team buffs that Amagi provides. With one other IJN main fleet ship already in the fleet, she becomes the best option in terms of damage output. The obvious choices to be paired being Shinano or Amagi. Between the two, I would favor Amagi as long as you have IJN ships with torpedo damage in the Vanguard, for example Kazagumo or Unzen, which benefit from Amagi's torpedo damage buff a lot more than Shinano's debuffs. The fewer IJN torpedo ships you have, the closer the two will be, but realistically, you need at least 3 IJN ships just for Shinano's own buffs. So if you're using just 2 IJN main fleet ships with Shinano and Hakuho, you'll have to run at least 1 IJN Vanguard. So it's hard to imagine a scenario where you're using Hakuho with Shinano that will be better than Amagi. There's nothing stopping you from using the 3 of them together, which I look forward to doing so myself because I really like all of them. But objectively speaking, the best performing fleets will likely not field all of them without all the stars aligning. With the current roster of ships and enemy trends, it is crucial to bring Trafalgar for her evasion rate debuff, which hinges on your flagship being a battleship. And with the likes of Lion and Mecklenburg, that's not exactly a tall task. You also do have to take the boss's movement patterns into account, which may call for the addition of Implacable, or perhaps at least Soyuz. Keep in mind these nitpicks are for using 3 IJN carriers together, and Hakuho should easily find a place in fleets paired with Amagi, and another main fleet ship that the situation calls for. She really feels like the complete opposite of Fritz Rume. While Rume has a fighter specialist loadout and her only weakness is her damage against heavy armor, Hakuho has a torpedo bomber specialist loadout, and the only thing she's really good at is annihilating heavy armor. While Rume has no restrictions on what kind of equipment she can use or teammates she can be sortied with, Hakuho relies on having an IJN torpedo bomber in her first slot, and at least one IJN main fleet teammate. And lastly, while Rume has a universal debuff for your entire fleet that massively increases your value, Hakuho is the recipient of others' powerful buffs, and doesn't offer much to the rest of her allies. For a player like myself who has everything available at my disposal, I see myself reaching for her as one of the first options when a heavy armor boss comes around, but for a developing player, I would not recommend prioritizing raising her over some other options, as her use case is limited to heavy armor boss busting and there are options that might not be necessarily as good, but get pretty close, while being useful for other content as well. For example, SX Retrofit, Fritz Rume, Lion, and so on. It'll be interesting if they add an actually strong IJN aviation battleship similar to Kearsarge, because then Hakuho would be able to make full use of her rotating skill 2 paired with only said ship, which would be a huge improvement. Alright, let's move on to I-404. Now this is the absolute most core of all core ships. Before even looking at her combat capabilities, she has a cross-fleet buff in her yellow skill from the Submarine fleet, which affects your surface fleets. So, even if you can't be bothered to ever learn about submarines, if you just get her for free from the event shop, raise her yellow skill, and even if you relieve her at level 1 with no equipment in your Submarine fleet, you're still getting value out of her from the 10% accuracy buff, which is not insignificant. On top of that, if you do raise her level, again without knowing anything about submarines, she gains a large amount of aviation stat, which will contribute to your airspace control value. Now, what if you do want to use her? She is also one of the strongest submarines in combat due to her high base stats, having seaplanes in her third slot over destroyer guns that typically do nothing on submarines, and then some of the highest oxygen capacity in the game, meaning she can bring another damage auxiliary instead of being locked to just snorkel. Or maybe she can even make use of the oxygen capacity and run a completely different setup from other submarines. If you're running some kind of USS or Ironblood submarine fleet, and you're wondering if she would be an upgrade over the weakest link in your fleet, I would lean toward yes, but to be transparent, I haven't been paying attention to submarines in a while. I've seen a lot of the Rainbow submarine torps being used while I'm still stuck with my bitters, so I might be out of touch here. In any case, she is must-have for her inherent value, even when not being used in combat, because there's literally no trade-off for bringing her, and she's easily obtainable by playing the event, so make sure you don't miss out on her for no reason. Also, her skin is really meta, because as you can see, despite being restrained and unable to act, she's still providing an accuracy buff to your other fleets. Next up is Oomi. Her second skill is a normal barrage with a fixed arcing part and straight shells, as well as a few torpedoes sprinkled in. The Vanguard buffs are not completely useless, but because they are rotating, the value is not super high. All of the sauce in her kit is in the first skill, which takes about 30 seconds to stack to full, but once fully stacked, not only does she gain significant buffs to her gun damage, but more importantly, she sets her secondary guns to 95 range. For reference, if you've ever used Prince Rupee, her Go secondaries have 100 range, so 95 is just 5 short of that, which is a very small difference. Unlike Rupee though, her secondary is not a fixed Go secondary, but potentially 3 Mogador guns at 200% efficiency, which is multiple times more DPS. With this, her damage potential is extremely high, but will also vary from battle to battle. Whether the enemy will move on the vertical axis will highly impact its hit rate, and it can be hampered by enemy shields, and so on. With a ship like Daisen or Monarch, you know what you're going to get, but you'll have to actually test Oomi out in different battles to see if she's actually going to be effective, but the potential is definitely there. Next up is Asama. She is a torpedo-focused heavy cruiser in Ibuki's class, and she's more team-oriented than Ibuki, lacking a lot of Ibuki's meaty self-buffs. The 70% chance to activate Barrage is slightly triggering for me, since it's not particularly strong and it's 2025. It's also not targeted like Ibuki's, so it's not as effective. Her torpedo buffs for other heavy cruisers also aren't that strong. The most obvious team composition to make the most use out of this buff is with Ibuki and Unzen, but even then you're probably going to be better off using Jinsu Meta or Aurora as your buffer instead. With a full torpedo heavy cruiser composition, you're going to be completely lacking in things like anti-air, anti-submarine, main fleet buffs, and also not even have a dedicated tank, so I wish her buffs could be a little bit stronger than they are to compensate. Moving on, I looked over Minase and Taikazu's kits briefly and found nothing particularly useful, just some cute colored descriptions. The last ship I'll cover is Shiratsuyu's retrofit. She has one big shortcoming, which is that she's still quite squishy, even with the retrofit stats, but otherwise she's well-rounded, having some anti-air, main fleet protection, Vanguard torpedo buffs, and decent damage output. But yeah, none of her skills improve her own survivability, which is an issue with her low base stats. Finally, there's the Ryusei Kai, which is the same thing as the improved quad mags compared to the base quad mags. It's stronger than the base Ryusei in every way. In fact, its total damage is even higher than that of the VIT-2, which it is noticeably faster than. The usual timing caveats for the other torpedo bombers still apply, especially for Sayun and VIT-2, but otherwise this is a top priority to upgrade to +13. Anyway, that's it for this update. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.